Do you know that before your ancestors ever raised a city, or carved a god, or wrote a single word, something walked this earth that was larger than us? Not a beast, not a monster of the deep, something that looked like us, and thought like us, and towered over us. And here is the part that should keep you awake tonight. Almost every people who ever lived remembered it. They lived on different continents. They were separated by oceans they could not cross, by languages that shared no root, by thousands of years of silence between them. And yet, when you read their oldest stories, you find the very same figure standing at the dawn of the world, a giant. The Hebrews called them Nephilim, the fallen ones, the mighty men of renown. The Greeks remembered the Titans, a towering race that ruled before the gods we know. The people of the Americas, who never set eyes on the old world, told of giant men with red hair who came before them. In Sardinia they built tombs and called them the graves of giants. From the Andes to the Bible, from Norse sagas to native legend, the memory is the same. How does a story travel to every corner of a world that had no way to share it? Think about that. A myth can spread when people meet, when they trade, when they conquer. But these peoples never met. And still they buried the same memory in their sacred texts, their folklore, their monuments of stone. It is as if humanity, scattered across the face of the planet, was all trying to remember the same thing. And it is not only the stories, it is the bones. For centuries, farmers turning their fields, workers digging foundations, explorers opening ancient mounds, have reported human skeletons of impossible size. Femurs longer than a man's arm, jaws that fit over a living face, skulls that do not match anything we are supposed to be. Some of those reports were frauds, some were mistakes, but not all of them are so easily dismissed. There are doorways in ancient ruins built too tall for any purpose we understand. There are beds of iron recorded in scripture, measured out in cubits, for a king no ordinary man could have shared a room with. And there is the uncomfortable question that runs beneath all of it, the one that mainstream history would rather you never ask. What if we were not the first? What if, before our age began, this world belonged to someone else? A greater race, a stronger race, that ruled the earth and then vanished from it, leaving behind only their bones, their monuments, and a memory so deep that every culture we know still carries it. In this documentary, we are going to follow that memory across the entire world, into scripture, into myth, into the ground itself. You will hear the evidence, and you will hear the doubts, and you will decide for yourself whether the giants were only a story, or whether we are living on the graves of the ones who came before. Welcome. To understand why the idea of giants is so difficult to dismiss, you have to begin with a single strange fact. It is not the size of the bones. It is not the height of the doorways. It is the sheer, staggering reach of the memory itself. Go anywhere on earth, open the oldest surviving stories of any people, on any continent, and sooner or later you will find them. Giants, a race of enormous beings who came before, who ruled, who fought, who fell. They appear in the sacred literature of the ancient Near East. They stride through the mythology of Greece and Rome. They haunt the sagas of the frozen North. They live in the oral traditions of Native America, in the folklore of Africa, in the legends of the Pacific Islands, in the temple histories of India. This is not a story that belongs to one culture. It is a story that belongs to all of them. And that is the first thing that should give us pause, because myths, as a rule, are local. A people invents a god, a hero, a monster, and that figure belongs to them. When the same figure turns up somewhere else, historians can usually trace the road it traveled. Trade brought it, Conquest carried it, migration spread it. Stories move the way people move, along the paths that connect one civilization to another. But the giant does not obey that rule. The giant is everywhere, including in places that had no path connecting them to anywhere else. Consider what that means. When the peoples of the Americas told their stories of giant men who ruled the land before them, they were separated from the storytellers of the old world by two vast oceans. They had not read Genesis. They had never heard of the Titans. They shared no language, no scripture, no ancestor within tens of thousands of years. And yet the shape of the memory is unmistakably the same. A former race, larger than us, powerful and often violent, that came first and was destroyed to make way for the world we know. How do you explain that? There are only a few possibilities, and every one of them is remarkable in its own way. Perhaps it is pure coincidence, the human imagination reaching independently for the same idea over and over across the whole species. Perhaps it is something buried deep in how our minds work, a psychological instinct to imagine those who came before as larger than ourselves. Perhaps it is the result of real discoveries, ancient peoples digging up the fossil bones of enormous animals and reconstructing from those bones a race of giant men. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility the mainstream will not touch, it is a memory. A real memory of something that was really here. We are going to weigh all of those explanations before we are done. This documentary will not ask you to believe. It will ask you to look, because the memory does not survive only in words. It survives in stone, and it survives in the ground. Across the world, there are monuments that local tradition has always attributed to giants. Enormous walls built of blocks so large that later peoples could not imagine human hands had moved them, and so assumed a giant race must have done it. Tombs shaped and sized for bodies far beyond our own. Structures whose builders vanished, leaving behind only the legend that they were not like us. On the island of Sardinia, there are burial monuments that the islanders themselves have called, for as long as anyone can remember, the tombs of the giants. And then there are the bones. This is where the subject becomes most controversial and most dangerous to handle honestly. For more than 2 centuries, there has been a steady stream of reports from newspapers, from farmers, from workmen, from antiquarians, describing the discovery of giant human skeletons. Some come from the burial mounds of North America. Some come from Europe, from the Middle East, from South America. Many of these reports, we will see, were hoaxes or honest errors, and we are not going to pretend otherwise. But the volume of them and the persistence of them is itself a phenomenon that demands an explanation. Woven through all of this is the most famous source of all, the one that gave the giants their most enduring name, the Hebrew Scriptures. In the book of Genesis, in just a few haunting lines, we are told that there were giants in the earth in those days, born of a union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. They are called the Nephilim, and they are described as mighty men, men of renown. From that single passage flows an entire tradition, expanded in other ancient texts, of a fallen race, of forbidden knowledge, and of a world so corrupted by these beings that it had to be washed away in a flood. That is where we will begin our journey, because it is the richest and most influential account we have. But it is only the beginning. From the Nephilim, we will move to the other giants of the Bible, the nations of towering peoples the Israelites claim to have encountered in the Promised Land, the Anakim and the Rephaim and their kin, and to Goliath, the last famous echo of that bloodline. We will meet Og, the king of Bashan, a giant whose enormous iron bed was recorded in Scripture, and whose survival poses a genuine puzzle within the tradition itself. We will cross into Greece and the war of the gods against the Titans and the Gigantes, a mythology that tells, in its own language, the very same story of a former race overthrown. We will stand among the megaliths of Sardinia, where legend and stone meet. We will travel to the Americas, to the giant traditions of native peoples and the strange accounts of red-haired giants and Patagonian giants that early explorers swore they had seen. We will confront the darkest and most disputed corner of the whole subject, the 19th century reports of giant skeletons and the persistent claim that a great institution deliberately destroyed the evidence. We will examine the elongated skulls that so many believe are the proof of a separate species. And then we will step back and ask the largest question of all. Why does every culture on Earth remember giants? And what would it mean if the answer were true? Through every one of these chapters runs a single thread. Not just that giants were remembered, but that they were remembered the same way. As those who came first, as those who ruled, and as those who were brought down by war, by flood, by the will of the gods, so that a new age, our age, could begin. It is a pattern too consistent to ignore. A race of giants, then a catastrophe, then us. So let us follow the memory to its source. Let us go back to the oldest and most famous account of all, to a few lines in an ancient text that have echoed for 3,000 years. Let us go back to the moment the sons of God came down. There is a passage in the book of Genesis so brief and so strange that readers have argued over it for more than 2,000 years. It sits near the beginning of the Hebrew scriptures, just before the story of the great flood, almost hidden, as if the writer set it down and hurried past it. But those few lines have haunted the imagination of the Western world ever since. They are the source, the origin, the foundation stone of everything we mean when we speak of giants. The passage tells us that when human beings began to multiply across the face of the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that these daughters were beautiful, and they took them as wives, choosing any they wanted. And then comes the line that changed everything. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The same offspring became the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Read it slowly, because almost every word of it is a mystery. Who were the sons of God? Why did their union with human women produce giants? What exactly were the mighty men of renown, and what became of them? The text does not explain. It states these things as though its first audience already knew what they meant, and then it moves on toward the flood that will soon drown the world. For the ancient reader, this was clearly a reference to something familiar, a story already old when Genesis was written down. For us, looking back across the gulf of millennia, it is a door standing open onto a lost tradition. The word the Hebrew text uses is Nephilim, and its meaning only deepens the mystery. Most scholars trace it to a root that means to fall, or the fallen ones, the fallen. It is a name heavy with implication, suggesting beings who came down, who descended, who fell from some higher state or some higher place. When early translators rendered the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, they reached for a word their own culture would understand, and they chose gigantes, giants. And so the Nephilim entered the Western imagination under that name and have never left it. But who were the sons of God who fathered them? This is the question that has divided interpreters for centuries, and the answer you choose transforms the entire story. There are broadly two great traditions of interpretation, and they could hardly be more different. The first, and the more cautious, holds that the sons of God were simply men. Specifically, they were the righteous descendants of Seth, the godly line of humanity, who corrupted themselves by intermarrying with the wicked descendants of Cain. In this reading, there is nothing supernatural happening at all. The giants are just powerful men, tyrants and warlords, and the sin being described is one of the faithful abandoning their faith. This interpretation has the advantage of keeping the story firmly within the human world. It removes the strangeness. It makes Genesis 6 a moral lesson rather than a supernatural event. But it also struggles against the plain sense of the words, because everywhere else in the Hebrew scriptures the phrase sons of God does not mean righteous men. It means divine beings, angelic beings, members of a heavenly host. When the phrase appears in the book of Job, it clearly refers to celestial beings who present themselves before God. And if that is what the words meant to the ancient audience, then Genesis 6 is describing something far more disturbing than a marriage between two human families. It is describing a union between the heavenly and the earthly, between beings that were never meant to mix. This is the second and the older, and by far the more dramatic interpretation. And it is not a modern invention. It is, in fact, how the most ancient Jewish sources understood the passage. To recover that understanding, we have to turn to a text that is not in most Bibles at all, but which was treasured by ancient readers, and which fills in the story that Genesis leaves so tantalizingly blank. We have to turn to the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is one of the strangest and most influential religious texts ever written. It was composed in the centuries before the Common Era, attributed to the figure of Enoch, the ancestor who, Genesis tells us, walked with God and was taken up without dying. For a long time it was lost to the Western world, surviving in full only in the ancient language of Ethiopia, where it was preserved as sacred scripture. When it was rediscovered and translated, it revealed an entire mythology hidden behind the terse lines of Genesis. And at the heart of that mythology are the giants. According to the Book of Enoch, the sons of God were angels, a specific group of them, 200 in number, called the Watchers. They were beings assigned to observe humanity from the heavens, to watch over the world. But watching became desire. Looking down upon the daughters of men, they lusted after them, and their leader, a figure named in the text as Semjaza, feared to act alone, feared to bear the guilt by himself. So he bound the others by an oath, 200 of them together, that they would descend as one and share the crime, so that no single watcher could be blamed. And so they came down upon the summit of a mountain, the text says, and from there they went out among humankind. They took wives, and their wives bore children, and the children were not human. The Book of Enoch describes these offspring as giants of enormous and terrible size, and it describes what they did to the world. The giants consumed everything the labor of men could produce until humanity could no longer sustain them. And when the food ran out, the giants turned against humanity itself. They began to devour people. They drank blood. They destroyed. In the vivid, horrifying language of the text, the whole earth was filled with violence and corruption because of them, a world groaning under the appetite of a race it had never been meant to bear. But the giants were only half of the catastrophe, because the Watchers, according to Enoch, did something else, something the text treats as almost worse than the giants themselves. They taught. They gave humanity forbidden knowledge. One of them, named Azazel, taught men to make swords and knives and shields and armor, the instruments of war. He taught them to work metals, and he taught the women the arts of ornament, of jewelry and cosmetics, and the beautifying of the body. Others taught sorcery and the cutting of roots and the reading of the stars and the signs of the sun and moon, secrets that, in the logic of the text, were never meant to be in human hands. Heavenly knowledge, poured out upon the earth before humanity was ready for it, corrupting and accelerating and deforming the natural course of the world. This is why the Watchers are called fallen. They fell not only physically, descending from heaven to earth, but morally, betraying their purpose and spreading ruin. And the Nephilim, their children, carry that same double meaning in their very name, the fallen ones, born of the fallen ones. Now, whatever you believe about the origins of this text, notice what it accomplishes. It takes the maddening brevity of Genesis 6, those few unexplained lines, and it gives them a full and coherent story. The sons of God are the Watchers. The giants are their monstrous children. The corruption of the world, which Genesis mentions only in passing before the flood, is here given a cause. The earth had to be cleansed because it had been overrun by the giants and by the forbidden knowledge their fathers had unleashed. And that connection between the giants and the flood is the key to everything that follows. Because when you read Genesis with the Book of Enoch in mind, the flood stops being an arbitrary punishment. It becomes a response. A world had been broken. A boundary had been crossed that should never have been crossed. The heavenly and the earthly had mingled and produced something that belonged to neither realm, a race of beings that fed on the world and terrorized it. And the flood was the great correction, the washing away of a contaminated age, so that the world could begin again, clean. In this telling, the giants are not a footnote to the flood story. They are the reason for it. The Book of Enoch even tells us the fate of the Watchers and their children. The archangels looking down on the ruin of the earth carried the cries of humanity up to heaven, and judgment was pronounced. The Watchers were bound and imprisoned beneath the earth, chained in darkness to await a final punishment. And their children, the giants, were made to turn upon one another, to destroy each other in slaughter, before the flood came to finish what was left. But the tradition adds one more chilling detail. When the giants died, their enormous bodies perished, but something of them remained. Their spirits, born from the union of heaven and earth, could not simply depart. They remained upon the earth as evil spirits, restless, homeless, afflicting humanity from that day forward. In this ancient view, the physical race of giants was destroyed, but its shadow was never fully lifted from the world. Whether or not one takes any of this as literal history, its influence is impossible to overstate. This story, the descent of the Watchers, the birth of the Nephilim, the corruption of the world, and the cleansing flood, became one of the foundational myths of Western religion. It shaped how generations understood evil, temptation, and the boundary between the human and the divine. It gave the giants their name and their character, and it planted, at the very root of our civilization's sacred literature, the idea that before the world we know, there was another world, a world that had to be destroyed. And here is what makes it more than just an isolated piece of scripture. That same essential shape, a race of giants, a time of corruption or conflict, and a catastrophe that ends their age, is exactly the shape we will find again and again as we travel the world. We will find it in Greece, in the war against the Titans. We will find it in the Americas, in the legends of giant peoples destroyed. We will find it in fragments and echoes almost everywhere we look. Genesis and Enoch simply give us the most detailed and most famous version of a story that somehow belongs to all of humanity. Of course, the skeptical response to all of this is straightforward, and it deserves to be heard. The Book of Enoch, a critic would say, is not history. It is religious literature composed long after the events it claims to describe, drawing on the mythological imagination of the ancient Near East, a world full of stories about gods, spirits, and monstrous beings. The giants of Enoch, in this view, are theology, not memory. They exist to explain the presence of evil in the world and to justify the flood, not to record a vanished race. And the resemblance between this story and the giant myths of other cultures could simply reflect the fact that many ancient peoples shared a similar imaginative world, or that the human mind everywhere tends to picture the deep past as an age of larger and more powerful beings. That is a serious argument, and we will return to it. But it does not quite dissolve the mystery for one simple reason. The tradition itself always insisted that these beings were real and that they had left physical traces behind. The ancient writers did not treat the Nephilim as a parable. They treated them as an extinct people, one whose descendants and remnants could still, in later ages, be encountered in the flesh. And that is precisely what the Bible claims happened next, because the giants, according to Scripture, did not vanish entirely with the flood. Somehow, on the far side of that great catastrophe, they were still there, waiting in the land that a wandering people would one day be told was theirs to take. To find them, we have to follow the Israelites out of the wilderness and to the borders of a promised land already occupied by a race that made them feel like insects. The flood, in the biblical account, was meant to be an ending, a clean break, a drowning of the corrupted world so that humanity could begin again from the family of Noah, the one righteous line preserved through the waters. The giants, the Nephilim, the monstrous fruit of that forbidden union should have perished with everything else that the flood swept away. And yet, when we open the scriptures again centuries later, the giants are still there. This is one of the genuine puzzles of the biblical text, and we will confront it directly when we come to the strange case of Og of Bashan. But for now, simply hold the fact in your mind. The book of Genesis tells us that there were giants in the earth in those days. And then it adds 4 words that have troubled readers for millennia. And also after that, after the flood. The giants somehow returned, or perhaps they never entirely left. Fast forward then, past the flood, past the scattering of the nations, to the story of a single people. The Israelites, according to the narrative, have been led out of slavery in Egypt and into the wilderness, journeying toward a land they have been promised, a land said to be flowing with milk and honey. And as they approach its borders, their leader Moses does the prudent thing. He sends 12 spies ahead, one from each tribe, to scout the land, to see what kind of country it is and what kind of people live there. The spies are gone for 40 days. And when they return, they bring back 2 things. The first is evidence of the land's astonishing fertility, a single cluster of grapes so enormous that it has to be carried on a pole between 2 men. But the second thing they bring back is terror. They report that the land is good, yes, but that the people who live in it are powerful and their cities are fortified and vast. And then they say something that has echoed down the ages. We saw the Nephilim there, they report, the descendants of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And in their own words, they confess the effect this had on them. We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, they say, and so we seem to them grasshoppers, insects. That is how these scouts describe themselves in the presence of the people of the land, not merely outmatched, but reduced to the scale of vermin, tiny creatures beneath the notice of the giants who towered over them. It is one of the most vivid images of relative size anywhere in ancient literature, and it was enough to break the will of an entire nation. The report of the spies spread panic through the camp. The people wept, they lost their nerve. They refuse to enter the land at all. The consequence in the narrative is severe. For their failure of courage, that entire generation is condemned to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they have died off, and only their children are permitted to enter the promised land. An entire generation lost, the story tells us, because of the giants. Who were these people who inspired such dread? The text calls them the descendants of Anak, the Anakim, and they are described consistently as a people of great height and strength, a race of giants dwelling in the hill country and in fortified cities. Their reputation was so established that it became proverbial. To say that a people were tall and strong was to compare them to the Anakim. They were, in the language of the ancient world, the benchmark of the giant, but the Anakim were not alone. As you read through the historical and legal books of the Hebrew Scriptures, you discover that the Promised Land and the territories around it were said to be dotted with whole nations of giants, each with its own name, its own homeland, its own place in the tradition. There were the Rephaim, perhaps the most important of all, a name that appears again and again and that seems to function as a general term for the ancient giant peoples of the region, the old giant stock from which the others descended. There were the Emim, described as a people great and numerous and tall as the Anakim, who had once inhabited the land of Moab. There were the Zamzumim, a name that seems to echo the strange, incomprehensible murmuring of their speech to foreign ears, said to have lived in the territory later taken by the Ammonites and again described as a people great and many and tall. And there were the Horites and others, named in the genealogies of the giant races. What is remarkable here is the specificity. This is not vague myth. The biblical text treats these giant nations the way it treats any other people, assigning them territories, histories, and relationships to the surrounding kingdoms. It tells us who displaced whom, which nation drove out which giant people from which land. It reads, in places, less like legend and more like an ethnographic record, a memory of the older, larger inhabitants who had held these lands before the current peoples arrived. And that pattern, the giants as the previous inhabitants, the ones who were there first and were displaced, is exactly the pattern we saw hinted at in the story of the Nephilim, and exactly the pattern we will meet again across the world. The giants are always the ones who came before, the original tenants of the land, the old rulers, now being pushed aside by a younger, smaller, but ascendant people. The scriptures even preserve what look like physical traces of these giant nations, details offered almost in passing, as if to lend weight to the claim. We are told of the remnant of the Rephaim and of specific individuals and places associated with them. There are references to giant cities, to regions known as the land of the Rephaim, to the last survivors of these peoples clinging on in particular strongholds even as their kind died out. The tradition is at pains to insist that these were real populations occupying real geography with a real and traceable decline. Now, the honest historian has to pause here and consider the mundane explanations, because they are real and they are reasonable. There is no question that different human populations vary in average height, and that an unusually tall population could inspire fear and exaggeration in their shorter neighbors. Ancient armies did sometimes include exceptionally large and powerful warriors, and the memory of facing such men could easily grow in the retelling. A frightened scout, returning from enemy territory, is not a neutral observer. Fear magnifies. Stories swell as they pass from mouth to mouth. The grasshopper comparison may tell us less about the literal height of the Anakim than about the terror they inspired. And there is another factor. subtle but important. In the ancient Near East, height and stature were bound up with ideas of nobility, power, and divine favor. To describe an enemy as a giant was, in part, to describe them as formidable, as God-touched, as belonging to an older and mightier order of things. Some of the giant language in these texts may be as much about status and dread as about literal measurement. So the skeptic has solid ground to stand on, tall peoples, exaggerated in fearful memory, elevated by the symbolic weight that height carried in the ancient mind. That may be all the Anakim and the Rephaim ever were. And yet, the consistency is hard to shake. It is not one giant mentioned once. It is nation after nation, named and located and described in the same terms across multiple books written across centuries. It is a whole vanished category of peoples, remembered always as taller, older, and prior. And it culminates in the one giant that even the most casual reader of the Bible knows by name. The one whose story would give the world its most enduring image of the contest between the giant and the ordinary man, because the tradition insists that the giants were not entirely wiped out when the Israelites finally did enter the land. A remnant survived. Pockets of the old giant stock endured in certain cities, particularly among the Philistines on the coast. And from that surviving remnant came a champion, a man whose height is given precisely in the text, whose armor is described in loving and specific detail, whose very name has become in every language touched by the Bible a synonym for an overwhelming and terrifying opponent, Goliath. The story is famous almost to the point of cliché, but strip away the familiarity and look at what it actually claims. Two armies face each other across a valley, the Israelites and the Philistines, neither willing to commit to battle. And out from the Philistine rank steps a single figure, a champion, who proposes to settle the matter in single combat. "Let one man come to fight me," he calls. "If he kills me, we will be your servants. If I kill him, you will be ours." And the text tells us his measurements. He stood, in the traditional reading, 6 cubits in a span, a height that works out, depending on the length of the cubit used, to something around 9 feet tall. It describes the bronze helmet on his head, the coat of scale armor weighing an enormous amount, the bronze guards on his legs, the javelin slung across his back, and the spear whose shaft was like a weaver's beam and whose iron head alone weighed a staggering amount. Even a man in front of him carried his shield, because the champion could not be burdened with it himself. For 40 days, the text says, this giant came out morning and evening and issued his challenge, and no one in the Israelite army dared to face him. The grasshopper terror of their ancestors had returned, embodied in a single towering man. And then, of course, comes the boy. David, too young for armor, armed only with a sling and 5 smooth stones from a brook, who refuses the giant's terms of combat entirely. He does not close to grapple where size would decide everything, but strikes from a distance, a single stone to the forehead, and brings the giant down. It is one of the most retold stories in all of human culture, the small defeating the large through cunning and courage rather than brute strength. But notice what the story assumes without ever pausing to argue for it. It assumes that a 9-foot giant is a plausible enemy. It presents Goliath not as a supernatural monster, but as a man, a Philistine warrior, a champion of flesh and blood who can be killed by a stone. And it links him through the geography and the peoples involved to that older tradition of the giant nations, the last remnant of the Anakim, who had settled among the Philistine cities. Goliath in this reading is not a one-off marvel. He is the final, fading echo of the age of giants, the last of a bloodline that stretched back through the Anakim and the Rephaim, all the way to the shadowy figures of Genesis. That is what makes the biblical giant tradition so coherent and so strangely persistent. It is not a scattering of unrelated tall tales. It is a single connected story told across the entire span of the Hebrew Scriptures. It begins before the flood with the Nephilim born of the sons of God. It continues mysteriously after the flood with the giant nations of the Promised Land. It names them, locates them, describes their decline. And it ends with a single famous duel in a valley, the last great giant felled by a shepherd boy, the old order of size and strength overthrown by the new order of faith and wit. The giants came first, the story says, and then one by one they fell, but we have skipped over something. Back before the conquest of the Promised Land, before Goliath, the Israelites in their wandering encountered one giant so remarkable that the Scriptures preserve the dimensions of his bed. A king, a giant king said to be the last of an ancient race, ruling a land that was itself known as the country of the giants. And his story contains the very puzzle we set aside earlier, the impossible question of how any giant at all could have walked the earth on the far side of a flood that was supposed to have destroyed them all. His name was Og, and his kingdom was Bashan. Among all the giants named in the Hebrew Scriptures, one stands apart, not because he is the tallest, though he may have been, not because of any great deed, for the text tells us little of his life. He stands apart because of a single extraordinary detail that the Scripture chose to preserve about him, a measurement, the dimensions of his bed. His name was Og, and he was the king of Bashan. The story of his end is told plainly in the narrative of the Israelite conquest. As the people journey toward the Promised Land, they come into the territory of Bashan, a region east of the Jordan, and its king comes out to meet them in battle with all his people. And Og is defeated, his army is destroyed, his cities are taken, and his kingdom passes into the hands of the Israelites. As a military episode, it is brief. Another king, another battle, another territory absorbed. But the text lingers on Og in a way it lingers on almost no one else. Because Og, we are told, was the last remnant of the Rephaim, the last survivor of that ancient race of giants we met in the previous chapter, the old giant stock that had inhabited these lands before recorded memory. He was, in the language of the tradition, the final representative of a dying breed, the last giant king of a giant people. And then comes the detail that has fascinated readers for thousands of years. To convey just how enormous this king was, the Scripture does not describe his body. It describes his bed. His bedstead, the text says, was made of iron, and it gives the measurements: 9 cubits in length and 4 cubits in width, according to the standard cubit of a man. Take a moment with those numbers because they are staggering. A cubit is traditionally reckoned as the length from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, roughly 1.5 feet. 9 cubits long, then, is somewhere around 13 to 14 feet. 4 cubits wide is around 6 feet. A bed 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. The text adds, almost pointedly, that this could still be seen, that the bedstead was preserved and on display in a city of the Ammonites, as if to say to the reader, if you doubt this, you can go and look at it for yourself. Now the careful reader immediately raises an objection, and it is a fair one. A man does not need a bed as long as he is tall, plus several extra feet. Even accounting for a bed larger than its occupant, a 13-foot bed frame implies a truly colossal individual, or else it implies exaggeration, a monument built to impress rather than a literal furnishing. Some interpreters have suggested that the object was not a bed at all in the ordinary sense, but perhaps a sarcophagus, a great basalt coffin of the kind known from that region, its dark iron-like stone giving rise to the description of iron. The black volcanic basalt of the Bashan region can indeed look metallic, and ancient megalithic coffins and dolmens of impressive size are found there to this day. So the skeptic has a ready reading. Og's iron bed may be a folk memory of one of the great megalithic monuments of the region, an enormous stone structure that later generations, gazing at it in wonder, attributed to a giant king. The dimensions may have grown in the telling. The whole account may be an origin story, a way of explaining an impressive and mysterious relic by imagining the giant who must have used it. That is a reasonable explanation, and it may well be the true one. But even if we accept it, notice what it does not resolve. It does not resolve the deeper puzzle that Og's very existence creates within the tradition itself. And that puzzle is this: how is Og here at all? Remember the framework we have been building. The giants, the Nephilim, were born before the flood. The flood was sent, in the fuller tradition of Enoch and its kin, precisely to destroy them, to cleanse a world they had corrupted. Every living thing not aboard the ark, the scripture says, perished in the waters. And yet, on the far side of the flood, the giants are back. The Rephaim, the Anakim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, whole nations of them occupying the promised land. And here is Og, explicitly named as the last of the Rephaim, a giant descended from that antediluvian stock, ruling a kingdom many generations after the waters had receded. If the flood destroyed the giants, how did the giants survive the flood? This is not a modern skeptic's gotcha. It is a problem that the ancient interpreters themselves saw clearly and wrestled with and tried to solve. And the solutions they proposed are among the strangest and most revealing traditions in all of giant lore, because they show us how seriously these readers took the reality of the giants. They did not shrug and say it was only a story. They treated it as a genuine historical difficulty that demanded a genuine answer. One tradition proposed that a single giant had survived by clinging to the outside of the ark. In this telling, Og himself, or a giant like him, was too large to drown in the ordinary way and rode out the flood perched upon the roof of the ark or clinging to a ladder on its side, kept alive by Noah, who passed food out to him through an opening. It is a bizarre image, the great vessel of salvation riding the floodwaters with a giant clinging to its hull, but it served a purpose. It explained, within the logic of the tradition, how the bloodline of the giants could have crossed from the old world to the new, how a race supposedly destroyed could reappear on the other side. Another tradition suggested that the waters of the flood, for whatever reason, did not cover every place equally, or that some giants were of such stature that they could survive where all else drowned. Still others proposed that the giant nations after the flood were not descended from the original Nephilim at all, but arose from a second, later incident, a fresh incursion of fallen beings, or a resurfacing of the same corruption, producing new giants in the post-Diluvian world. This is why Genesis, in that haunting phrase, says, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that." The tradition itself seems aware that the giants come in two waves, before the flood and after it, and struggles to connect them. What matters, for our purposes, is not which of these solutions is correct. What matters is what the very existence of the debate reveals. The ancient readers of these texts were not treating the giants as obvious fiction. They were treating them as a real feature of the deep past. a genuine race whose survival across the great catastrophe posed a real historical problem worthy of serious and sustained explanation. The giants, to them, were not a metaphor. They were an ancestry, a lost chapter of the world that had to be reconciled with the rest of the story. And Og sits at the very center of that reconciliation. He is the bridge, the living link between the antediluvian giants and the giant nations of the Promised Land, the last of the Rephaim, the final king of a race that should not, by all the logic of the flood, have existed at all. When the Israelites defeated him and took his kingdom, the tradition presents it as more than a military victory. It is the closing of an age. The last giant king falls, and his land, the land of Bashan, the land that had been known as the country of the Rephaim, the country of the giants, passes finally into the hands of ordinary men. Bashan itself deserves a word because its reputation in the ancient world was dark and specific. It was remembered as a land apart, a place associated with the Rephaim, and in some of the oldest strands of Near Eastern tradition, with the realm of the dead and with old defeated powers. Its very name carried a weight of ancient dread. This was giant country, the last stronghold of the old race, a region where the deep past pressed close to the surface. To conquer Bashan was to conquer the last of the old world, and there is one more thread worth pulling because it connects Og back to the very beginning of our story. Some traditions identified Og not merely as a survivor of the flood, but as a figure of almost impossible antiquity, a being who had lived since before the flood, who had witnessed the old world with his own eyes. In these tellings, Og is not just the last of the Rephaim by descent. He is a literal remnant of the antediluvian age, a creature who had walked the earth when the Nephilim still ruled it, who had somehow endured through the flood and down through the generations until at last he met his end at the borders of the Promised Land. A living fossil of the age of giants, carrying in his enormous frame the memory of the world before the waters came. Whether Og was a colossal king, a megalithic tomb misremembered, or a folk memory of the region's ancient stone monuments, the tradition surrounding him tells us something important. The people who preserved these texts believed that a race of giants had once ruled the earth, that they had survived a world-ending catastrophe, and that their last representatives had persisted into historical times, into lands that could be named and conquered and mapped. The giants were not to them a fairy tale set in no particular place. They were the previous owners of specific real estate, the old kings whose defeat cleared the ground for the world we know. And now hold that idea in your mind, that image of a former race of giant beings who ruled before, who were overthrown, whose fall marked the beginning of the current age, because we are about to leave the Hebrew scriptures behind. We are going to travel west across the Mediterranean to a completely different civilization with a completely different language, a completely different religion, and completely different gods. And we are going to find, at the very foundation of their mythology, the exact same story, a race of enormous beings who ruled the cosmos before the current order, a great war that overthrew them, and a new age, our age, born from their defeat. The Greeks called them the Titans. Leave the deserts of the ancient Near East behind, cross the Mediterranean to a different world, a world of olive groves and blue islands, of philosophers and poets, of a civilization that would lay the intellectual foundations of the West. The Greeks shared no scripture with the Hebrews. They worshipped a crowded pantheon of gods, utterly unlike the single God of Israel. Their language, their culture, their entire way of imagining the divine were their own. And yet, when the Greeks told the story of how the world began, They told it as a story of giants, of a former race of enormous primordial beings who ruled the cosmos before the gods we know, of a great and terrible war that overthrew them, and of a new order, the world as it now is, born out of their defeat. It is the same shape, the very same shape we found in Genesis and Enoch, a prior race of giant beings, a cosmic conflict, and a new age rising from the ruins of the old. Two civilizations that could hardly have been more different, reaching independently for the same fundamental story. The Greeks called the first of these beings the Titans. According to the great Greek account of the origins of the world, in the beginning there was chaos, and then came the earth, Gaia, and the sky, Uranos. And from the union of earth and sky were born the Titans, a race of 12 powerful deities, enormous and primordial, the first great generation of divine beings. They were not the gods of the classical world, not Zeus and his family enthroned on Olympus. They were older than that. They were the generation before, the rulers of an earlier age of the cosmos, when the familiar gods had not yet been born. Their names ring with ancient power. Kronos, the youngest and most formidable, who would come to rule over all the Titans. Oceanus, the vast river said to encircle the world. Hyperion, associated with the light of heaven. Themis, the embodiment of divine order. Iapetus, whose sons would include figures central to the fate of humanity. These were the Titans, and in the first age of the world, they reigned. The story of how they came to power is itself a story of violence between the generations, and it sets the pattern for everything that follows. Uranos, the sky, the father, feared his own monstrous children and imprisoned some of them within the earth, causing Gaia terrible pain. And so Gaia conspired with her Titan children to overthrow the father. It was Kronos, the youngest, who dared to act. He ambushed his father and cast him down, seizing power for himself and the Titans. The first ruler was overthrown by his children. The first age ended in an act of rebellion and violence. And Kronos, now the ruler, having overthrown his own father, became consumed by the fear that the same fate awaited him. It had been foretold that one of his own children would one day overthrow him, just as he had overthrown Uranos. And so Kronos did a monstrous thing. As each of his children was born to his wife Rhea, he swallowed them whole, one after another, to prevent the prophecy from coming true. He devoured his own offspring to preserve his reign. But Rhea, in grief and desperation, saved the last of them. When her youngest son was born, she hid him away and gave Kronos a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes to swallow in the child's place. And the child she saved, hidden and raised in secret, grew to manhood, determined to overthrow his father and free his swallowed siblings. That child was Zeus. And so we come to the great war at the heart of Greek mythology, the conflict that would decide who ruled the cosmos. On one side, the Titans, the old order, the primordial giants who had governed the world since the beginning. On the other, Zeus and his brothers and sisters, the new generation of gods, the Olympians, rising up to overthrow their elders exactly as their elders had once overthrown the generation before them. The Greeks called this war the Titanomachy, the Battle of the Titans. And they described it as a conflict of world-shaking violence, lasting 10 long years, the heavens and the earth trembling with the fury of it. The sea roaring, the very foundations of the cosmos shaking as the two orders of divine beings fought for supremacy. In the end, Zeus and the Olympians triumphed. The Titans were defeated and cast down. Many of them were hurled into Tartarus, a deep abyss below the earth, a prison as far beneath the world as the sky is above it. And there they were bound, imprisoned in darkness beneath the ground. Stop and notice that image, because we have seen it before. The old race of giant beings, defeated and overthrown, imprisoned beneath the earth in chains of darkness. That is almost precisely the fate of the Watchers in the Book of Enoch, bound beneath the earth to await their final judgment. Two entirely separate traditions, the Hebrew and the Greek, and in both of them the old order of giant beings ends its days chained in a dark pit below the world. The parallel is uncanny, and the Titans were not the only giants in the Greek imagination. There was a second race, distinct from the Titans but often confused with them, called the Gigantes. It is from their name, Gigantes, that our very word giant descends. According to the tradition, the Gigantes were a race of enormous and terrible beings, born from the earth, who rose up in their own war against the gods of Olympus, a conflict called the Gigantomachy. Once again, the gods of the current order faced an uprising of giant beings, and once again, after a tremendous struggle, the giants were defeated and put down. The Greeks even pointed to specific places in their landscape, volcanic regions, places of earthquakes and sulfurous vents, and said that beneath them lay the buried bodies of defeated giants, still stirring, their struggles causing the ground to shake and the mountains to smoke. Here is something remarkable about that last detail, and it gives us our first real clue to one of the great mundane explanations for the giant myths. The Greeks in certain places believed that the enormous bones of the ancient giants could still be found in the ground, and they were not imagining this. Throughout the Mediterranean world, people did periodically dig up or find exposed by erosion gigantic bones, enormous thigh bones, massive skulls, remains far too large to belong to any human being. And to the ancient mind, with no knowledge of prehistoric animals, there was an obvious explanation. These were the bones of the giants, the remains of the Titans and the Gigantes who had ruled before and been cast down. We now know what many of those bones actually were. They were fossils, the remains of prehistoric creatures, mammoths and mastodons, giant extinct mammals, whose massive bones, weathering out of the earth, looked to ancient eyes exactly like the skeletons of colossal humanoid beings. A mammoth skull, with its great central cavity where the trunk attached, can look startlingly like the skull of a one-eyed giant. And some scholars have suggested that such finds helped inspire the legend of the Cyclops. The bones were real, the interpretation was mythological, and out of that collision between genuine fossil discoveries and a mind that had no concept of extinct species was born, at least in part, the Greek conviction that giants had once walked the earth. We are going to return to this explanation because it is one of the most powerful of the mundane accounts of the giant myths, and it may explain a great deal. But hold this thought alongside it. The fossil explanation tells us why people might have believed the earth held the bones of giants. It does not by itself explain why the giants of Greek myth are cast in exactly the same narrative role as the giants of Hebrew scripture and of so many other traditions. The former rulers, the prior order, the beings who came first and were overthrown so that the current world could begin, because that is the truly striking thing about the Titans. It is not merely that the Greeks imagined giant beings, it is the story they told about them. A race of enormous primordial beings ruled the world in an earlier age. They were overthrown in a great cosmic war. They were cast down, many of them imprisoned beneath the earth, and from their defeat arose the current order, the world as it now is. Change the names, and you are telling the story of the Nephilim, a race of beings born of the union of heaven and earth, who dominated the primordial world, who were destroyed in a great catastrophe, whose leaders were bound beneath the earth, and after whose fall the current age of ordinary humanity began. The Greek Titanomachy and the Hebrew tradition of the Watchers and the Flood are, at their deepest structural level, the same story. A former age of giants, ended by cataclysm, giving way to ours. And it does not stop with Greece. The Greeks passed their titans to the Romans, who absorbed the whole mythology into their own. But even beyond the classical world, the pattern recurs with a persistence that is hard to explain away. In the mythology of the Norse, the world of ice and long winters far to the north, the very first being was a primordial giant, Ymir, from whose enormous body the world itself was made. And the gods of the Norse were locked in perpetual conflict with the race of frost giants, the ancient, hostile, primordial beings who had come before them, and who would, at the end of the world, rise again to destroy them. Once more, giants first. Once more, giants as the old order, the primordial enemies of the current gods. The same story told in the deserts of the Near East, on the islands of Greece, in the frozen north. A former race of giant beings, a great conflict, a new order born from their fall. Now the skeptic has a response to this, and it is worth stating fairly, because it is genuinely powerful. Human cultures, the skeptic says, tend to imagine the deep past in similar ways, because human minds are similar. It is natural to imagine that the beginning of the world was ruled by beings greater than ourselves, that there was a golden age or a primordial age of mighty powers before the ordinary present. It is natural to imagine conflict between the generations, since human families know such conflict, and the specific detail of giant bones can be explained by fossils found and misinterpreted across the ancient world. Put these tendencies together, and you can generate the giant myth independently again and again, without any need for a real race of giants. The similarity of the stories reflects the similarity of the human imagination, not the memory of a shared reality. That is a strong argument. It may even be the correct one, but it has to reckon with just how specific and how consistent the pattern is. It is not simply that many cultures imagined big beings. It is that so many of them cast those beings in precisely the same narrative role, the overthrown former rulers, and surrounded them with the same specific motifs, the imprisonment beneath the earth, the cosmic war, the giving way to a new order. Coincidence of imagination can explain a general resemblance. It strains harder to explain a resemblance this exact. We will keep testing that argument as we go, but for now we have established something important. The giants are not a peculiarity of the Bible. They stand at the foundation of the classical world's mythology too, and of the Norse, and of others. Wherever we look in the old world, we find the same towering figures at the dawn of things. But the old world is connected. Its peoples, however distant, shared a web of contact and influence stretching back into deep prehistory, and a skeptic can always argue that the giant story spread along those ancient threads, passed from culture to culture in the dim past before recorded history began. To truly test whether the memory of giants is universal, we need to find it somewhere that web could not reach. We need to cross an ocean to a hemisphere sealed off from the old world for thousands of years, to peoples who could not possibly have borrowed the story. We need to go to the Americas, and when we get there, we will find the giants waiting for us. Before we cross the ocean, there is one more place in the old world we have to visit, because so far our journey through the giants has been a journey through words, through scripture, through myth, through the stories that ancient peoples wrote down and passed on. And words, however consistent, however haunting, are still only words. A skeptic can always say that a story is just a story. But there are places on earth where the memory of giants is written not in words, but in stone, where you can walk today among enormous monuments raised by a vanished people, structures so massive and so mysterious that the later inhabitants of the land could only explain them one way. They must have been built by giants. One of the most extraordinary of these places is an island in the middle of the Mediterranean, Sardinia. Sardinia is the second largest island in the Mediterranean Sea, a rugged land of mountains and coastline lying west of the Italian peninsula, and it is covered, quite literally covered, with the remains of one of the most enigmatic megalithic cultures in all of human history. Scattered across the island, in numbers that are difficult to believe, stand thousands of ancient stone towers. The Sardinians call them nuraghi, and nobody knows with certainty exactly who built them or precisely why. These are not small structures. The nuraghi are massive conical towers built of enormous stone blocks stacked without mortar, some of them stacked so skillfully and so tightly that they have stood for thousands of years. The largest of them are complex fortresses, with multiple towers linked by walls, interior chambers, staircases winding up through the stone, and courtyards. They rise from the Sardinian landscape like the strongholds of some forgotten age, which is exactly what they are. There are thousands of them across the island, the remains of a civilization we call, for lack of any other name, the Nuragic culture, after the towers themselves. This culture flourished on Sardinia in the Bronze Age, many centuries before the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome rose to prominence. They were master builders in stone, raising their towers across the entire island, and they left behind not only the nuraghi but other monuments as well, including something even more directly connected to our story. They built tombs, long monumental burial structures of stone, and the Sardinians who came after them, gazing at these enormous graves, gave them a name that has stuck for centuries. They called them the tombs of the giants. The tombs of the giants. In the Sardinian tradition, these long megalithic burial monuments with their great central slabs and their curving forecourts of standing stones were the graves of a race of giant beings who had once inhabited the island. The name was not given by modern sensationalists. It is the traditional local name passed down through generations of islanders who lived among these monuments and needed some way to explain them. The people who built such things, the tradition held, could not have been ordinary men. They were giants. Why would they believe that? Stand before one of these monuments, and the answer becomes intuitive. The stones are enormous. The scale of the construction, achieved by a people without the machinery we take for granted, seems to demand builders of superhuman strength and size. When a later, humbler people encounters the works of an earlier, more accomplished one, and cannot imagine how ordinary humans could have raised them, the mind reaches for an explanation that fits the scale of the achievement. Giants built this. Only giants could have. This is a pattern that recurs all over the world, and it is worth naming clearly, because it is one of the most important of the mundane explanations for giant traditions. Again and again, across many cultures, enormous ancient structures whose builders have been forgotten are attributed to giants. In Greece, there were massive fortification walls built of stone so huge that the later Greeks, unable to imagine human hands moving them, attributed them to the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of myth. We still call that style of construction Cyclopean masonry to this day. precisely because the ancients believed only giants could have built it. The logic is the same everywhere. Big stones imply big builders. Forgotten monuments imply a forgotten race. So the honest observer has to acknowledge right at the outset that the tombs of the giants on Sardinia do not prove that giants existed. The name may tell us nothing about the actual size of the Nuragic people and everything about the awe their descendants felt in the presence of monuments they could not explain. The tombs are real. The giants who supposedly built them may be nothing more than an attempt to account for the impossible scale of the stones. And yet, there is more to the Sardinian story than the towers and the tombs, and this is where it becomes genuinely intriguing. Some years ago on Sardinia, archaeologists uncovered one of the most remarkable finds of Mediterranean prehistory, a site associated with the Nuragic culture that yielded an extraordinary collection of stone statues. These sculptures, reconstructed from fragments, depict warriors, archers, and boxers, figures of the Nuragic world rendered in stone, and they are large, substantially larger than life-size, some of them standing well over 2 meters tall in their reconstructed form. These towering stone figures, with their great round eyes rendered as concentric circles, gazing out across the millennia, seemed to some observers to be exactly what the legend had always promised: statues of the giants, made by the giants, or in their image. Now, we must be careful and honest here, because this is precisely the kind of finding that gets distorted. Larger-than-life statues do not mean that the people who made them were larger than life. Cultures throughout history have made colossal statues of ordinary-sized beings, from the pharaohs of Egypt to the emperors of Rome. A statue 2.5 meters tall is evidence of ambition and skill, not necessarily of a race of giants. The scholarly consensus is that these statues represent the heroized dead, or figures of Nuragic religion and society, rendered at a grand scale for effect, as monumental art so often is. They tell us about the artistic and spiritual world of the Nuragic people. They do not, on their own, tell us that those people were giants. But here is what the honest observer must also grant. The convergence is striking. On this one island, we have a mysterious, forgotten, megalithic culture of extraordinary builders. We have thousands of massive stone towers. We have monumental tombs that the local tradition has always called the tombs of the giants. And we have larger-than-life statues of warriors emerging from the same culture's ruins. The stones, the tradition, and the statues all point, however circumstantially, in the same direction. It is not proof, but it is exactly the kind of place where legend and physical reality seem to brush up against one another. And this is the deeper value of Sardinia to our story. Not that it proves giants were real, because it does not, but that it shows us concretely how the giant tradition takes root. Here, on a real island, we can watch the process happen. A vanished people leaves behind monuments of overwhelming scale. Their identity is forgotten. The people who come after cannot explain what they see, and so they reach for the explanation that fits the scale of the stones. Giants. The land fills with tombs of the giants, with legends of a race of great builders who came before. Multiply that process across the entire world, across every place where a forgotten people left behind works that later inhabitants could not comprehend, and you have a powerful engine for generating giant traditions. The megalithic monuments of Europe, the great walls and platforms of forgotten cultures, the enormous stones moved by peoples whose techniques were lost, all of them invite the same explanation. And all of them, in one tradition or another, have received it. This land was the land of the giants. They built these things. They are gone now, but their works remain. So Sardinia gives us something valuable and something double-edged. It gives us the mundane explanation in its clearest form, the way that awe before ancient stone becomes a legend of giant builders. But it also gives us something the pure skeptic cannot quite dismiss, a place where the tradition of giants is anchored not in a vague story, but in tangible, visitable, monumental reality. You can go to Sardinia. You can stand before the tombs of the giants. You can look up at the towers of a people whose name we do not even know. And you can feel in the shadow of those stones exactly why the memory of giants has been so impossible to kill. The stones are the point. Whatever built them, they are real and they are enormous, and the people who lived among them for centuries were certain, absolutely certain, that giants had raised them. Sardinia is one island, one culture, one tradition, but the pattern it reveals, forgotten builders remembered as giants, is worldwide. And now, finally, we are ready to cross the ocean, to leave the entire interconnected world of the old world behind, its scriptures and its myths and its megaliths, and to travel to a hemisphere that was sealed off from all of it for thousands upon thousands of years. If the memory of giants is only a story that spread from culture to culture along the roads of the ancient world, then it should stop at the water's edge. It should not be waiting for us on the other side of an ocean that no story could cross. But it is. In the Americas, among peoples who never read Genesis and never heard of the Titans, the giants were there all along. Here is where the mystery becomes truly difficult to explain away. Everything we have looked at so far, the Nephilim of the Bible, the Titans of Greece, the frost giants of the Norse, the tomb builders of Sardinia, belongs to a single connected world. The peoples of the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean and Europe were bound together by a vast web of contact stretching back into deep prehistory. Traders traveled between them. Armies marched between them. Stories passed between them, carried along the roads and sea lanes that linked the old world into one great, if loosely woven, whole. And so a skeptic can always argue that the giant story spread along those threads. One culture invented it, and it traveled, mutating as it went, until it turned up everywhere from Israel to Iceland. That argument, whatever its merits, has one absolute limit. It cannot cross the ocean. For thousands of years, the peoples of the Americas were sealed off from the peoples of the Old World. Since the end of the Ice Age, when the land bridge that once connected Asia to the Americas vanished beneath the rising seas, the two hemispheres had gone their separate ways in near total isolation. The civilizations of the Americas, the great cultures of Mesoamerica and the Andes, the countless nations and peoples spread across two enormous continents, developed on their own, cut off from Europe and Asia and Africa by two vast oceans. They had never read the Hebrew scriptures. They had never heard of the Greek Titans. They had no contact whatsoever with the traditions we have been tracing, and they remembered giants. Across the Americas, from the far north to the southern tip of the continent, native traditions tell of a race of giant beings who came before. The specifics vary from people to people, as you would expect from cultures spread across two continents and thousands of years. But the essential figure recurs with a persistence that is genuinely hard to explain. A former race larger than ordinary people, powerful, often violent, who inhabited the land in an earlier age and who were in the end destroyed or driven out. Consider some of what the traditions preserve. Among various native peoples of North America, there are accounts of a race of giants who lived in the land before them. Some of these traditions describe the giants as fierce and dangerous, even as cannibals. enormous beings who preyed upon ordinary people until they were at last defeated and wiped out. In certain traditions, there was a great final battle or a deliberate campaign in which the ancestors of the current people rose up and destroyed the giants, ending their reign of terror and inheriting the land. Once again, notice the shape. The giants come first. The giants are overthrown. The current people inherit the world from them. It is the same structure we found in Genesis, in the Titanomachy, in the Norse sagas, now appearing on a continent that had no contact with any of them. One of the most striking and specific of these traditions concerns giants with red hair. In certain accounts from the American West, the giants who were said to have inhabited the land before were described as having red or reddish hair. This is a detail that has attached itself to one particular and famous legend associated with a cave in which a tribe of red-haired giants was said to have been trapped and destroyed by the ancestors of local peoples. The story has been told and retold, embellished and disputed, and it has become one of the most enduring pieces of American giant lore. We must be cautious with it because it has been heavily shaped and sensationalized in later retellings, and the archaeological reality behind it is contested. But the core tradition of a former race of large red-haired people destroyed in the deep past is one that native accounts in the region genuinely preserve. Then there is the strangest and best documented chapter of all, the one that pulled the giants of the Americas out of native oral tradition and into the written records of the European explorers themselves, the Patagonian giants. When the first European expeditions rounded the southern tip of South America in the age of the great sea voyages, they came back with an astonishing claim. They reported that the native people they had encountered along the southern coast of the continent, in the region that came to be called Patagonia, were giants. Not merely tall, but giants, towering figures who dwarfed the Europeans who met them. The accounts described the explorers coming up only to the waists of these people, or reaching only to their shoulders. The name Patagonia itself is traditionally connected to these reports of the giant people of the far south, and this was not a single isolated claim, easily dismissed as one sailor's tall tale. The reports of the Patagonian giants persisted for a very long time, repeated by expedition after expedition over the course of centuries. Voyage after voyage returned from the far south of the Americas with accounts of a people of extraordinary stature. The belief became so established in Europe that for generations the giants of Patagonia were regarded as simple geographic fact marked on maps, discussed in learned works, accepted as one of the known peoples of the world. It was one of the most widespread and long-lived beliefs in the entire age of exploration. So what was really going on with the Patagonian giants? Here the honest answer is illuminating, and it teaches us a great deal about how giant traditions are born from real experience. The native peoples of that region, particularly the people we now know as the Tehuelche, were in fact unusually tall by the standards of the Europeans of that era, who were on average considerably shorter than people are today. These were genuinely big, powerfully built people, among the tallest populations on Earth at the time. A short European sailor encountering a population of exceptionally tall and robust people, wrapped in bulky furs that made them look even larger, in an unfamiliar and intimidating landscape at the very edge of the known world, would have every reason to perceive and remember them as giants. The reports were not simply invented. They were exaggerations, but they were exaggerations built upon a real foundation, a genuinely tall people, magnified by fear, distance, unfamiliarity, and the natural tendency of travelers' tales to grow in the telling. And that, right there, may be one of the most important lessons in our entire investigation. The Patagonian giants show us, in the full light of recorded history, exactly how a giant tradition comes into being. Not usually out of nothing, not usually as pure fabrication, but as the exaggeration of something real. A tall population becomes a race of giants. A big warrior becomes a colossus. A monument of great stones becomes the work of a giant race. The kernel is real. The giant is what the kernel grows into, under the pressures of fear, awe, memory, and storytelling. But hold that lesson alongside the deeper puzzle, because the Patagonian case, for all that it demystifies, does not dissolve the larger mystery. The larger mystery is not any single giant tradition. It is the universality of the pattern. Why do the peoples of the Americas, in isolation from the entire Old World, not merely have tall populations, but tell the same kind of story that the Old World tells, of a former race of giants who ruled before and were destroyed? The tall Tehuelche explain the Patagonian giants of the explorers' reports. They do not explain why native traditions across two continents so often frame the deep past as an age of giant beings, overthrown to make way for the present people. That framing is the thing that keeps recurring everywhere on both sides of the ocean, because that is the heart of it. The giants of the Americas matter in our story precisely because the Americas were isolated. If the memory of giants were only a tale that spread from a single source along the roads and sea lanes of the Old World, it should have stopped at the ocean. It should not be waiting on the far shore among peoples who could not possibly have borrowed it. And yet there it is, a former race of giants, an age that ended, a current people who inherited the land from the fallen ones. Two hemispheres, sealed off from each other for the whole span of recorded human memory, and the same figure standing at the dawn of both their worlds. The skeptic still has answers, and we will weigh them fully before we are done. Perhaps the human mind, everywhere, independently imagines the deep past as an age of giants. Perhaps every continent has its own tall populations and its own ancient monuments and its own fossil bones weathering out of the ground, and every continent therefore generates its own giant legends from the same raw materials. These are real possibilities, and they carry real weight, but the pattern is now global. Not one culture, not one region, not one connected web of peoples, but the entire species, on every inhabited continent, carrying the same memory. And that brings us to the darkest and most contested chapter of the whole subject. Because if giants were real, if a race of them once walked the earth, then somewhere in the ground there should be bones. And for more than a century, people have claimed again and again that the bones were found, and that someone made them disappear. Now we come to the most contested, the most sensational, and the most treacherous part of the entire subject. This is the terrain where the giant story is most exciting to its believers and most infuriating to its critics. This is where we have to be at our most careful, because it is here that the line between genuine mystery and outright hoax becomes almost impossible to see. We are going to walk that line honestly. We are going to give the claims their full force, and then we are going to tell you what the evidence actually shows. The claim is this, that over the past 2 centuries, particularly across North America, the physical remains of giants have been discovered again and again, enormous human skeletons dug from the earth. and that these discoveries, rather than being celebrated as the greatest anthropological finds in history, were quietly suppressed, covered up, that the bones vanished into the vaults of a great institution, never to be seen again, and that the truth about a race of giants who once inhabited the Americas has been deliberately hidden from the public. Let us begin with what is real, because there is a real foundation beneath this, and it is important to understand it. In the 19th century, across the United States, there was a genuine phenomenon of newspaper reports describing the discovery of giant skeletons. This is not invented. If you go back through the archives of American newspapers from that era, you will find them, dozens upon dozens of them, hundreds if you search widely enough. A farmer plowing his field uncovers an enormous skeleton. Workers digging a foundation or a canal unearth human bones of impossible size. An ancient burial mound is opened, and inside is found a skeleton far larger than any living man. The reports often include specific details, measurements of 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet, and more. Descriptions of enormous jawbones that fit over the face of the discoverer, of double rows of teeth, of skulls of extraordinary size. These reports were real in the sense that they genuinely appeared in great numbers in the press of the day. That much is simply a fact of the historical record, and they are tied to something else that is entirely real and genuinely remarkable: the mound builder cultures of North America. Across the eastern and central United States, there are thousands of ancient earthen mounds, some of them enormous, built by native cultures over a span of thousands of years. Some of these mounds are burial sites. Some are vast, geometrically precise earthworks whose scale and sophistication astonished the European settlers who encountered them. In the 19th century, as the young country expanded westward, these mounds were opened and excavated in large numbers, sometimes by serious early antiquarians, often by amateurs, treasure hunters, and the merely curious. And out of this widespread, largely uncontrolled digging came a flood of reports about what the mounds contained, including again and again the claim of giant skeletons. So we have two real things: a real phenomenon of numerous newspaper reports of giant skeletons, and a real, remarkable, genuinely ancient mound-building civilization whose earthworks were being opened up across the continent. Out of the collision of those two realities came the legend of the American giants and the great cover-up. Now, the central accusation, the claim, repeated endlessly in books, in videos, across the internet, is that a particular institution, the great National Museum and research body of the United States, deliberately gathered up these giant skeletons and destroyed them or hid them away in order to suppress the truth. The story usually runs that in its early decades, as it took charge of American archaeology, this institution collected the giant bones that were being unearthed across the country and then made them disappear to protect a mainstream account of history that had no room for a race of giants. We are going to examine this claim directly because it deserves a direct answer. And the honest answer is that, as a specific historical accusation, it does not hold up. The most commonly cited version of the cover-up story, the one that gets shared and reshared as though it were documented fact, traces back to a fabricated source. It is a hoax, and a traceable one. The dramatic account of the institution being ordered to destroy giant skeletons, complete with official-sounding details, originated in a piece of deliberate fiction, a fabricated news story of the kind that spreads virally precisely because it is so satisfying to believe. It presents itself as investigative reporting. It is not. It was manufactured. And once you follow the specific cover-up claim back to its root, you find not a suppressed document, not a leaked report, not a whistleblower, but an invented story designed to look like one. That is the plain truth of it, and we are not going to pretend otherwise because the honesty is the whole point. But now, having said that clearly, we have to be equally honest about what remains, because the subject is not quite as simple as debunking a single hoax. Consider the newspaper reports themselves. They were real, and they were numerous, and the question of what actually lay behind them is more interesting than either the true believers or the dismissive skeptics usually allow. What were people actually finding and reporting in such numbers? Several things, almost certainly, all mixed together. Some of the reports were outright fabrications invented by newspapers of an era when the press was fiercely competitive and a sensational giant story sold papers. This was the great age of the newspaper hoax, when publications routinely printed astonishing tales with little regard for truth, and a giant skeleton was reliable circulation gold. Some of the reports were misidentifications, ordinary bones exaggerated in size, or the bones of large animals mistaken for those of giant humans, exactly the kind of error that had fueled giant legends since ancient Greece. Some may have been honest but distorted accounts of genuinely large individuals, or of ordinary skeletons whose dimensions grew with each retelling. And some were connected to deliberate manufactured hoaxes, physical fakes constructed to fool the public, of which the era produced several famous examples, elaborately faked giant bodies exhibited for profit and wonder. Add all of that together, and you can account for the great wave of 19th century giant reports without any need for a real race of giants, and without any need for an institutional cover-up, a sensation-hungry press, a landscape full of genuine ancient bones being dug up in uncontrolled conditions, a public primed by the Bible and by folklore to believe in giants, and a scattering of deliberate hoaxes together are more than enough to produce a flood of giant skeleton stories. The mundane explanation is not only available, it is, frankly, compelling. And yet the honest investigator is left with a residue, a grain of something that resists complete dismissal. Part of that residue is simply the sheer volume and persistence of the reports, coming from many different places, many different people, many of whom had no obvious motive to lie and no connection to one another. It is easy to dismiss any single report. It is harder to feel entirely comfortable dismissing all of them, sight unseen, especially when the physical evidence, whatever it was, is no longer available to examine. And that unavailability is itself the source of the enduring suspicion. The bones, whatever they were, are largely gone. The mounds were often dug up carelessly, their contents scattered, lost, discarded, or never properly documented in the first place. Early American archaeology was frequently a chaotic amateur affair, and an enormous amount of material was destroyed or lost, not through conspiracy, but through sheer carelessness and the passage of time. And here is the subtle point that keeps the mystery alive. The believers say the bones were hidden by a cover-up. The evidence says the bones were lost to hoaxes, errors, and careless excavation. But both sides agree on one crucial fact. The bones are not here now. There is no giant skeleton you can go and examine, no verified giant remains sitting in a museum case available for study. And into that absence, that empty space where the physical evidence should be, the imagination pours endlessly. It is far easier to believe in a suppressed truth than in a mundane muddle of fakery and loss. The cover-up story is emotionally satisfying in a way that the honest answer, a chaotic mess of hoaxes and carelessness, simply is not. So where does that leave us, honestly? It leaves us here. The specific famous claim that a great institution was documented destroying giant skeletons is a traceable hoax, and we should say so plainly. The flood of 19th century giant reports is real as a phenomenon, but is best explained by a combination of press sensationalism, misidentification, exaggeration, and deliberate fakery without recourse to a genuine giant race or an organized cover-up. And yet the subject retains a genuine grain of mystery, not because the cover-up is real, but because the physical evidence, whatever it truly was, has largely vanished, leaving us unable to close the case with the certainty we would like. That is the honest verdict, not the triumphant vindication the believers want, and not quite the total dismissal the hardest skeptics prefer. A hoax at the center, a real phenomenon around it, and an irreducible uncertainty at the edges, born of evidence that is no longer there to examine. This same shape, a sensational claim of physical proof, a core that dissolves on close inspection, and a stubborn residue that will not quite go away, is exactly what we find when we turn to the other great piece of supposed physical evidence for a race of giants. Not skeletons this time, but skulls. Strange, elongated skulls, unlike anything in an ordinary human grave that have been offered for decades, as the hard proof that a separate species once walked among us. They are real objects. You can see them, hold them, study them, and that makes them a very different kind of puzzle from the vanished bones of the mounds. The vanished skeletons of the last chapter had a fatal weakness as evidence. They were gone. You could not examine them, measure them, test them. They lived only in old newspaper reports and in the space where the physical proof should have been. The elongated skulls are different. They are real. They exist. They sit in museums and private collections. They have been photographed and measured and studied, and you can, in principle, go and look at them with your own eyes. And they are, without question, strange. So strange that for many people they represent the single most compelling piece of physical evidence that a different kind of being, a separate lineage, perhaps a race of giants, once existed on this earth. The most famous of them come from a place on the coast of what is now Peru, a desert peninsula called Paracas. There, more than a century ago, an enormous ancient cemetery was discovered containing the remains of a mysterious culture, and among those remains were skulls of an extraordinary shape. Instead of the rounded cranium we all recognize, these skulls are dramatically elongated, stretched backward and upward into a long tapering form. The effect is genuinely uncanny. Placed beside an ordinary human skull, they look like they belong to something else entirely, something not quite human, and Paracas is not unique. Elongated skulls have been found in many parts of the world, in South America, in Mesoamerica, in the ancient Near East, in parts of Europe, in Africa, across a startling range of cultures separated by vast distances and long spans of time. Wherever they appear, they provoke the same reaction, a sense of wrongness, of encountering a shape that the human head is not supposed to take. And out of that reaction has grown an entire body of theory. The claim, made insistently across countless books and videos, is that these skulls are the remains of a separate species, that their shape is not human at all, that they are the physical proof of the giants, or of something even stranger, a non-human lineage that once lived among us, or came to us from elsewhere. The specific claims pile up quickly, that the skulls are too large, holding more brain volume than a normal human skull, that they lack the sutures, the joints, that normal human skulls have, that their shape cannot be produced by any natural or cultural process, and therefore must reflect a fundamentally different kind of being. That here at last, In these tangible objects is the hard evidence that the mainstream refuses to confront, so let us confront it, honestly and in full. Here is what the science actually shows, and it is important, because this is one of those cases where the truth is genuinely well established, and we would be misleading you to pretend otherwise. The overwhelming majority of elongated skulls, including the famous ones, are the result of a practice called artificial cranial deformation. And this practice is not mysterious. It is thoroughly documented, well understood, and was carried out by numerous cultures around the world, in some cases into relatively recent times. The technique works because of a simple biological fact. In a newborn infant, the skull is not yet fused into the hard, rigid structure of the adult head. It is soft, pliable, made of separate plates that have not yet knit together, precisely so that the head can pass through the birth canal and so that the brain can grow. If during these early months and years the head is bound wrapped tightly with cloth or bound between boards or pads, the growing skull will be gently and permanently reshaped by that constant, sustained pressure. Bind the head one way, and it grows long and tapering. Bind it another, and it grows flattened. The brain inside develops normally, but the shape of the skull that houses it is molded, like clay, into the form the binding dictates. Many cultures did exactly this, deliberately as a mark of beauty, of status, of group identity, of belonging. To the people who practiced it, an elongated head was not a deformity. It was an ideal, a sign of nobility or tribe, achieved through a practice as intentional as any other form of body modification. Parents shaped their children's heads the way other cultures pierced ears or filed teeth or marked the skin. And the result, thousands of years later, is a cemetery full of skulls whose shape looks to modern eyes unaware of the practice utterly alien. This is not speculation. The practice is attested in historical records, observed and described by later observers, and demonstrated by the physical evidence itself. Bound skulls often show the telltale marks of the binding, subtle impressions and flattening consistent with the pads and wraps that shape them. And crucially, artificial deformation changes the shape of the skull without changing its internal volume in the way the sensational claims suggest. It reshapes the container without adding to what it holds. The claims of dramatically increased brain capacity, of impossible shapes, of features that no human process could produce, do not survive contact with the actual anatomy. The shape is unusual. The mechanism that produced it is not. What about the more specific claims, the ones about missing sutures, or unusual features that supposedly prove a non-human origin? Here, the honest answer is that these claims tend to dissolve under expert examination. Human skulls vary. Sutures confuse in unusual ways or be difficult to see, or be affected by the deformation itself. Individual specimens can have genuine peculiarities that, cherry-picked and presented without context, look far more anomalous than they are. When actual specialists in human anatomy and ancient populations examine these skulls, the verdict is consistent. They are human. Human skulls, reshaped by a known human practice, belonging to known human populations. So on the central question, the science is clear, and intellectual honesty requires us to say so without hedging. The elongated skulls are not the remains of a separate species. They are not proof of a race of giants or of non-human beings. They are the remains of human beings whose skulls were deliberately shaped by their own cultures according to ideals of beauty and identity that we can document and understand. As evidence for a literal race of giants, they simply do not work. But now, having been that clear, let us also be honest about what remains genuinely interesting, because there is something here, and it is not what the sensationalists claim. The truly fascinating thing about the elongated skulls is not any individual specimen. It is the distribution. It is the sheer worldwide spread of the practice of cranial deformation itself. Why did so many cultures across so many continents, separated by oceans and by thousands of years, independently arrive at the same idea to bind the heads of their infants into an elongated shape? Why does this specific peculiar practice recur again and again in the Andes, in Mesoamerica, in the ancient Near East, in Europe, in Africa, in places that had no contact with one another? That is a real puzzle, and it echoes in a strange way the larger puzzle of our entire investigation. Just as the memory of giants appears independently across the isolated cultures of the world, so does the practice of shaping the head into a giant-like elongated form. And one intriguing possibility, though we must present it as speculation and not fact, is that the two are connected. That the practice of cranial deformation may have been in some cultures an attempt to imitate something, to make the human head resemble a revered form, the form of gods, of ancestors, of a remembered older race that these cultures held in awe. In this reading, the elongated skulls would not be the giants themselves, but a kind of homage to them, ordinary humans reshaping their own children in the image of the beings their traditions said had come before. We cannot prove that. It is a hypothesis, not a finding, and we present it honestly as such. The mundane and well-established truth is that cranial deformation was practiced for reasons of beauty, status, and identity, and that is sufficient to explain the skulls without any appeal to giants at all. But the deeper question, why the human species, across so many isolated cultures, was so drawn to this particular reshaping and so often connected the elongated head with nobility, divinity, and the revered past, remains genuinely open and genuinely fascinating. So the elongated skulls leave us in a position that by now is becoming familiar. The strong version of the claim that they are the physical proof of a giant or non-human race collapses under honest examination. These are human skulls, shaped by a human practice, and the science on this is not seriously in doubt, but at the edges, in the worldwide recurrence of the practice and its persistent association with a revered and superior kind of being, there lingers a smaller, subtler question that the debunking does not fully close. And that really is the pattern of this entire subject. The bold claims of hard physical proof, the vanished skeletons, the alien skulls, do not survive scrutiny. One by one, examined honestly, they fall. The giant skeletons dissolve into hoaxes and lost bones. The elongated skulls resolve into a documented cultural practice. The hard, tangible, undeniable proof of a race of giants is simply not there. If you came to this story hoping for a bone you could hold, a skull you could point to and say, "This settles it," then the honest answer is that no such thing exists. And yet the deeper mystery has not gone away. Strip away every false claim, every hoax, every misidentification, and you are still left with the thing we started with. The thing that no debunking touches. The memory itself. The fact that every culture on Earth, across every ocean and every age, remembers giants. That is the puzzle that survives when all the fake evidence has been cleared away. And it is time now to face it directly. Why does every culture remember giants? We have cleared away a great deal. We have followed the giants through scripture and myth, through megaliths and mounds, through vanished skeletons and elongated skulls. And along the way, We have been honest, sometimes painfully honest, about how much of the supposed physical evidence does not hold up. The famous cover-up is a hoax. The alien skulls are shaped by a human hand. The giant skeletons of the old newspapers dissolve into sensationalism and loss. If this were a story about physical proof, it would be over. The proof is not there, but it was never really a story about a single bone or a single skull. From the very beginning, the deepest and most durable part of the mystery was never the evidence. It was the memory. It was the astonishing, stubborn, worldwide fact that lies beneath everything else we have examined. Every culture, on every inhabited continent, across the entire span of human history, remembers giants. Strip away every hoax and every error, and that fact is still standing. It is the thing that does not go away. So now we have to face it directly and weigh as fairly as we can the possible explanations. Why does all of humanity remember the same thing? There are broadly two kinds of answer, the mundane and the extraordinary, and intellectual honesty demands that we take the mundane explanations seriously first because they are strong and because much of this documentary has shown them winning case by case. The first mundane explanation we have already met again and again: fossils. Throughout human history, in every part of the world, people have dug up or found exposed by erosion the enormous bones of prehistoric creatures. Mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths, dinosaurs, whales, and countless other great beasts of the deep past whose massive bones weather out of hillsides and riverbanks and desert cliffs. To a people with no concept of extinct species, no framework of deep geological time, no science of paleontology, these bones present an obvious and compelling explanation. They are the remains of giants. A gigantic thigh bone, a colossal skull, an enormous vertebra discovered in the ground naturally suggests a gigantic being. This single mechanism, operating independently everywhere that ancient bones are found, which is everywhere, could seed giant legends across the entire world with no contact between cultures required. It is a powerful explanation, and it surely accounts for a great deal. The second mundane explanation is the monuments. As we saw so vividly on Sardinia, wherever a forgotten people left behind works of overwhelming scale, enormous walls, great stone tombs, colossal structures moved by techniques since lost, the people who came after tended to reach for the same explanation. Only giants could have built this. Big stones imply big builders. Across the world, the ruins of vanished cultures have been attributed to giant races for the simple reason that their scales seem to demand builders larger than ordinary men. This too requires no contact between cultures. It arises naturally, anywhere that the monumental past outlasts the memory of who built it. The third mundane explanation is real human variation, magnified by fear and storytelling. As the Patagonian giants showed us in the clear light of recorded history, genuinely tall populations and exceptionally large individuals do exist, and encounters with them, filtered through fear, unfamiliarity, and the swelling of tales in the retelling, readily produce reports of giants. A tall enemy warrior, a big and imposing people met at the edge of the known world, become, in memory and in story, a race of colossi. The kernel is real. The giant is what the kernel grows into. And the fourth mundane explanation is psychological and perhaps the deepest of all. There may be something in the human mind that is simply predisposed to imagine the deep past as an age of greater beings. We do it instinctively. The ancestors loom larger than ourselves. The founders, the old heroes, the first people are pictured as mightier, taller, closer to the gods. Children look up, literally, at the adults who tower over them. And perhaps something of that experience is woven into how our species imagines those who came before. To remember the past as an age of giants may be less a memory of real giants than a natural habit of the human imagination, a way of expressing that those who came first were greater than we are now. Put these four explanations together: fossils, monuments, real tall people, and the mind's own tendency to enlarge the past, and you have a formidable account. Formidable enough, many would say, to explain the entire worldwide phenomenon of giant traditions without any need for a single real giant. Each mechanism operates independently, everywhere, requiring no contact between cultures, no shared source, no literal race of giant beings. The universality of the giant myth, on this view, is not evidence of a universal reality. It is evidence of a universal human situation. The same raw materials, the same mind, producing the same story again and again across the world. That is the skeptical case, and it is a genuinely strong one. We would be doing you a disservice to pretend it is weak. Much of this investigation has, in fact, shown these mundane explanations prevailing, dissolving one bold claim after another. And yet, even granting all of that, something remains that the mundane explanations do not quite fully capture, and honesty requires us to name it as clearly as we named their strength. It is not just that giants appear everywhere. It is the specific, recurring shape of the story that so many cultures tell about them. Look back over everything we have seen. It is not merely that cultures around the world imagine big beings. It is that so many of them, in isolation, cast those beings in precisely the same narrative role. The giants are the former rulers. They came first. They held the world in an earlier age. They were powerful, and often they were corrupt or violent or hostile to the order that would follow. And they were overthrown by flood, by war, by the gods, by the ancestors of the current people, so that the present age, our age, could begin. The Nephilim and the flood, the titans cast into the pit, the frost giants at war with the gods, the cannibal giants of the Americas, destroyed in a final battle. The same three-part structure again and again, a former age of giants, a catastrophe or conflict, the world that follows, inherited by us. The fossil explanation accounts for why people believed there were giant bones in the ground. It does not by itself explain why the giants of so many separate traditions occupy the same narrative role. The overthrown predecessors, the former masters of the world. The monument explanation accounts for why forgotten ruins were attributed to giants. It does not explain the recurring drama of the giants' fall, the war, the flood, the deliberate ending of their age. The mundane explanations are excellent at explaining the raw material of the giant myth, the bones and the stones and the tall strangers. They are less complete at explaining its plot, and that is where the extraordinary explanation stakes its claim. What if the reason so many cultures tell the same story of a former race of giants overthrown so that our world could begin is that the story is, in some form, a real memory? Not a memory manufactured independently from bones and monuments, but an inheritance, a genuine recollection of something that really happened in the deep past of our species, carried forward by every branch of humanity because every branch of humanity witnessed it or descended from those who did. We cannot prove that. Let us be as clear about the weakness of the extraordinary explanation as we were about the strength of the mundane one. There is no verified giant skeleton. There is no undisputed physical proof. The extraordinary explanation asks us to believe in a lost reality for which the hard evidence has conveniently vanished, and that is exactly the kind of claim we should treat with the deepest caution. A theory that explains the absence of its own evidence is a theory to be wary of, so we are left honestly holding both. On one side, a powerful set of mundane explanations that can account for most, and perhaps all, of the giant phenomenon without a single real giant. On the other, a residue, the uncanny consistency of the story's deep structure across isolated cultures, that the mundane explanations strain just slightly to fully absorb. The rational weight leans toward the mundane, the lingering mystery leans toward the extraordinary, and an honest mind can feel the pull of both. But there is one more dimension to the pattern that we have not yet fully drawn out, and it may be the most telling of all. It is not just that the giants came first and fell. It is what that recurring story might mean. Why would humanity everywhere feel the need to remember that the world once belonged to a greater race, and that this race was brought down so that we could inherit the earth? What is that story doing in the deep imagination of our entire species? To answer that, we have to look not at the giants' beginning, but at their end, at the strange universal insistence that the age of giants had to end, that it was always somehow doomed. We have spent this entire journey among the giants, but look back now across all of it, and you may notice something you did not see at first. In almost every tradition we have visited, the giants are not simply present, they are doomed. Their story is not a story of a race that lives on. It is, again and again, a story of a race that ends. This may be the single most consistent and most haunting feature of the entire worldwide phenomenon. Not merely that the giants existed, but that they had to be destroyed. That their age was always, from the beginning, an age with an ending built into it. Consider the sheer consistency of the catastrophe. In the Hebrew tradition, the giants, the Nephilim, are swept away by the great flood, a deliberate cleansing of a world their existence had corrupted. Their age ends in water. In the Greek tradition, the Titans are overthrown in the Titanomachy and cast into the abyss beneath the world, and the Gigantes are put down in their own war against the gods. Their age ends in cosmic battle. In the Norse tradition, the giants are the eternal adversaries of the gods, destined for a final apocalyptic confrontation at the end of the world. Their age ends in the twilight of all things. In the Americas, the giant peoples are destroyed in war, hunted down, wiped out, burned in caves, ended by the ancestors of the peoples who came after. Their age ends in fire and slaughter. Water, war, apocalypse, fire. The mechanism changes from culture to culture, but the outcome never does. The giants fall, the age of giants ends, and something new, smaller, and human takes their place. Why? Why does the human imagination everywhere insist not only that giants came first, but that they had to be destroyed? There is a shape here that goes beyond the mere existence of giants, and it is worth naming plainly, because it is the deep structure beneath every tradition we have examined. It is a story in 3 acts. In the first act, a race of great beings rules the world. In the second act, that race is overthrown by catastrophe, by conflict, by divine will. And in the third act, from the ruins of the old order, the current world arises, our world, the world of ordinary human beings who inherit the earth from the fallen giants, former rulers, catastrophe, inheritors. That is the pattern, and once you see it everywhere. And notice what that pattern accomplishes wherever it is told. It explains the present by reference to a vanished past. It tells the people who tell it who they are and how they came to possess the world. We are the inheritors, the story says. We are not the first. Before us, the world belonged to a greater and older race, mightier than we are. But that race is gone now, brought down, and the world has passed to us. We live on the graves of our predecessors. We rule a world we did not build, in the ruins of an age we did not see. This is a profound and strangely humbling story for a species to tell about itself, and it may be that its very universality reflects something true, not necessarily about literal giants, but about the human condition. Everywhere human beings seem to sense that they were not the first, that the world is old, older than us, and that we arrived late into a place already shaped, already marked, already haunted by those who came before. The giants may be the form that intuition takes, the face we put on the deep, unsettling awareness that the earth did not begin with us and does not belong to us alone. There is even perhaps a memory of real predecessors buried in it, though not necessarily the one the sensationalists imagine. Our own species, we now know, was not the only kind of human to walk the earth. There were other human lineages, other kinds of people, some of them larger, stronger, heavier boned than we are, who shared the world with our ancestors and then vanished, leaving us alone as the last surviving branch of a once crowded family tree. We do not need to claim that these were the giants of legend to notice the resonance. Our species does carry in its actual history the reality of having shared the world with other kinds of humans who came before and who are now gone. We are, in a real and literal sense, the inheritors of a world once shared with others who no longer exist. Perhaps some dim echo of that long coexistence and that long disappearance survives in the universal story of the vanished former race. Now let us be honest, as we have tried to be throughout, about the strongest and the weakest points of the whole case, because this is the moment to weigh them together. The weakest point is and remains the physical evidence. There is no verified giant skeleton. The famous cover-up is a hoax. The elongated skulls are the product of a known human practice. Every attempt to put a literal giant bone in your hand has failed. If the claim is that a race of physical giants, 9 feet tall or more, literally walked the earth, then the hard evidence for that claim is absent, and the mundane explanations, fossils, monuments, tall peoples, and the mind's own habits can account for the traditions without it. That is the honest weakness, and no amount of atmosphere should be allowed to obscure it. The strongest point is the pattern, not any single tradition, not any single bone, but the uncanny worldwide consistency of the 3-act story, the former rulers, the catastrophe, the inheritors, appearing across cultures that could not have shared it, framed again and again in the same terms. That pattern is real. It is not a hoax, and it is not easily dissolved. Whatever its ultimate cause, whether shared memory, shared psychology, or shared human situation, it is a genuine feature of the human record, and it is genuinely remarkable. The universality of the giant is a fact. It is only the interpretation of that fact that remains open. And so the age of giants ends, in every tradition, the same way it does in our investigation. Not with a triumphant discovery, but with a fall. The giants are cast down, and we are left standing in the world they left behind, holding their story but not their bones, inheritors of an age we can remember but cannot prove. Perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Perhaps the giants were always meant to be a memory rather than a skeleton, a story the whole species tells about the world that came before, and about our own strange, late inherited place within it. An age ended, the traditions say, so that ours could begin. And whether that age was real or imagined, the telling of it is one of the most universal things human beings have ever done. There is a reason the memory refuses to die. And in the end, beneath all the hoaxes and all the wonder, that reason may be the most human thing about the entire story. We have come a long way, from a few haunting lines in the Book of Genesis, across the whole face of the earth and the whole span of human memory, following a single figure that refuses to stay buried, the giant. And now, at the end of the journey, it is worth asking the simplest and perhaps the hardest question of all. After everything, after every hoax exposed and every wonder weighed, why does this story still hold us? Why does the memory of giants refuse to die? Because it does refuse. We have been as honest as we know how to be. We have shown you the fabricated cover-up, the misidentified bones, the skulls shaped by human hands, the sensational reports that dissolve under examination. We have handed the skeptic victory after victory because the skeptic earned them, and still the giants remain. Still, something in the story reaches past all the debunking and takes hold. That persistence is itself a fact worth explaining, maybe the most interesting fact of all. Part of the answer is simple wonder. The idea that we were not the first, that the world once belonged to beings greater than ourselves, is one of the most thrilling ideas the human mind can entertain. It cracks open the flat, familiar surface of history and hints at unknown depths beneath. It suggests that the world is stranger and older and more mysterious than we were taught, that there are chapters missing from the story, that the ground beneath our feet might still be hiding the bones of a forgotten age. That is an intoxicating thought, and no amount of debunking fully dispels it, because it speaks to something the evidence cannot touch, the desire for the world to be more than it appears. But there is more to it than the thrill. The memory of giants endures because it says something we seem to need to say over and over in every language and on every continent. That we came late, that we inherited rather than founded, that before us the world was already here, already ruled, already full, and that we are the ones who came after, into a place we did not make. That is a humbling truth, and the story of the giants is one of the oldest ways humanity has found to tell it. And notice, when you strip the story down to that core, how little it depends on the literal existence of 9-foot skeletons. Whether or not a physical race of giants ever walked the earth, the deeper thing the tradition preserves is real. We genuinely are not the first. Our species really did arrive into an ancient world, one shaped over unimaginable spans of time by forces and beings that came before us. We really are inheritors, living among the ruins and the remains of a past far older and far larger than ourselves. The giants may be a symbol, but the thing they symbolize is true. So what, in the end, do we actually have? Let us gather it honestly one last time. We have a worldwide tradition of giants appearing on every inhabited continent, among cultures that could not have shared it, framed again and again in the same 3-act shape. The former rulers, the catastrophe, the inheritors. That tradition is real, and its universality is genuinely remarkable, and it is not fully or comfortably explained away even by the strongest mundane accounts. That is the solid ground, the thing that survives every debunking. We have a set of powerful ordinary explanations, fossils misread as giant bones, monuments too large to be attributed to ordinary builders, genuinely tall peoples magnified by fear and distance, and the mind's own deep habit of imagining the ancestors as greater than ourselves. Together, these can account for most of the phenomenon, and honesty compels us to grant them their full force. The rational weight of the evidence leans their way, and we have an absence. No verified skeleton, no undisputed artifact, no bone you can hold. The hard physical proof of a literal race of giants is simply not there, and the most famous claims that it exists turn out, on inspection, to be hoaxes and errors. That absence is the great weakness of the extraordinary view, and we will not paper over it. That is the honest ledger, a remarkable pattern on one side, powerful mundane explanations, and a damning absence of proof on the other. And in between, an irreducible residue of mystery, small but real, that neither side fully dissolves. What still lies buried? That question, at least, is not closed. The earth is vast, and we have examined only the smallest fraction of what lies beneath its surface. Ancient sites remain unexcavated. Deep layers of the past remain unread. It is the nature of the deep past that it keeps its secrets well and surrenders them slowly and only sometimes. We should not pretend to a certainty in either direction that the evidence does not support. The believer who insists the giants were real reaches beyond what can be shown. But so does the skeptic who insists, with total confidence, that there is nothing left to find. The honest position is humility before a past that is older, larger, and stranger than any of us can fully grasp. Because that, finally, is the lesson the giants leave us with. Not the certainty that they were real, not the certainty that they were not, but the humbling recognition that we do not fully know who or what came before us, that the world did not begin with our arrival, that we walk on ground layered with the remains of ages we can barely imagine, carrying in our oldest stories the memory of a time that was not ours. The giants may never be found, the bones may never surface, the story may remain forever what it has always been, a memory without a skeleton, a legend without a grave. But perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the giants were always less about the size of a bone than about the size of the question they force us to ask. Were we the first? Is the world ours alone? Or did something greater walk here before us and leave in the deep memory of every people on earth the same unshakable insistence that we are the inheritors of a world we did not make? Every culture remembered them. On every continent, across every ocean, in every age, human beings looked back into the deep past and saw, standing at the dawn of the world, a race of giants. Perhaps they were only a story, or perhaps out there still, beneath the ice or the desert or the sea, the ground is keeping one more secret, waiting, as it has always waited, for someone to dig in the right place. What do you think? Were the giants only ever a myth, a shadow cast by fossils and monuments and the human imagination? Or do you believe that somewhere beneath our feet lies the proof of a race that ruled before us? Tell us in the comments. We read them, and this is a mystery we will never tire of discussing. If this journey changed the way you see the deep past and our own small place within it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more.